Okay, folks, we're going to move on to topic 3.2, the administration of these empires. And again, I'm going to be jumping around a little bit here. I'm making sure I follow the order it's in your packets. And there will be some extra information here that may help us with some comparison if we get a topic this on our DBQ. All right, so just going to kind of go down page 1 of this section. Divine right. This means a king's power comes from God. It is very similar to the mandate of heaven in China, which states that, as long as heaven is happy with you, you get to keep ruling. The rise of cities and their growth led to a decline in the power of the feudal lord, just that there was less people for them to rule over. And it also coincides with the rise of king's power and the king appointing the justice of the peace. So again, you now have the local leader is more serving at the pleasure of the king than otherwise. English Bill of Rights, written in 1688, is one of the first documents to limit the power of kings, and is really a pushback against absolutism. It is one of those founding documents that is the basis for our system of government here in the United States. Absolutism. And this is the idea that the king is all-powerful and he's really is God's representative. He's anointed by God, and this comes out of a lot of it comes out of divine right. Especially true in France, where the Catholic Church and the monarchy kind of team up to create an all-powerful king who then serves the purposes of the church. Louis XIV is the greatest example of the divine right absolutist monarch. He calls himself the Sun King, most famous for saying "L'État c'est moi," which means "I am the state." And he builds this huge palace at Versailles, which is a tribute to his power, and it's basically just a shrine to his one awesomeness. All right, and I'll show you a picture of that in a little bit. Okay, Russian society. A little different than Central and Western Europe. It's very diverse because of the geography. I mean, you have to think about that. Russia covers 11 time zones. There are so many different people from different backgrounds in Russia, even today. But the Russians are the dominant ethnic group. They occupy really the top of society. But Russia is also an agricultural country, still with serfdom. So you have a very hierarchical society with ruler and noblemen and priests on the top, and then the poor peasants and serfs on the bottom. The two kings that rule again during this period are Ivan the Terrible, or Ivan IV, and Peter the Great. Ivan is really the last of the more Asiatic or Mongol-style czars, ruling more as an Asian country than a European country. He is ruthless, as I said before, and he established the feudal system and serfdom to keep his subjects in line. Peter the Great comes along, and there's a slight little jag between the end of Ivan. Ivan dies childless, and then Peter's father rules for a while, but he dies when Peter's very young, so there's a regency. But finally, when Peter comes to power, he sets out on a whole new plan for Russia, and he wants to modernize and westernize it. He wants to turn Russia into a country more like the Western Europeans, who he has visited and seen that they're wealthy and way more advanced than Russia is. He challenges social and cultural norms. Much of that to do with the Russian style of dress, not allowing the traditional long coats or the traditional long beards, and a lot of other cultural things. He moves the capital of Russia from Moscow to St. Petersburg on the Baltic Sea. It becomes his window on the West, and he styles it after the Western capitals. And he starts shifting Russia towards a more modern industrial economy, and part of that is a modernization of the army. Okay, Ottoman Empire, the Devshirme. This is the blood tax on non-Muslims, and basically requires families to give up a son to the Ottomans to be trained for service to the Sultan. Usually that son converts to Islam. He has to learn Turkish, and then eventually becomes a bureaucrat in the civil service of the government, or a soldier. And those soldiers were called janissaries. They were really the elite military force that is the protector of the empire. They were the vanguard of the Sultan's army, the powerful part that came in and finished it off. Just kind of switching gears here to the Ming Dynasty real quickly. When the Ming Dynasty takes control, the way they consolidated power was to try to remove all traces of the Mongol rule when they took over and really make China Chinese again. Okay, Japan, it's a very interesting situation because they adopt the feudal system, and this system, as you probably would notice, is very similar to the system that was in Western Europe. Now, there is no evidence that there was any contact or copying of it, but the same idea spills up there. Okay, so you have, there's a couple of little differences. Okay, you've got your emperor on the top, and the emperor is more of a figurehead. He rules, he does not reign. The true power lies with the shogun, who rules in his stead. You have the daimyos, who are your large landowners, and they have samurai, who are hired guns or hired soldiers, and then ronin are kind of guys. They're free soldiers. They're paid soldiers. They're not hereditary. Then, kind of different from a lot of other cultures, you have the peasants class, not on the bottom. Okay, and these are 90% of the population. Finally, the people that actually occupy the lowest part of Japan, which is kind of amusing given what Japan is today, such an industrialized and business place thing. The artisans and the merchants occupy the bottom of the class, and now they're really the top of the class. Okay, so that's feudal system in Japan, and then the Tokugawa Shogunate is what establishes all this. Japan is ruled by a powerful family that ruled in the name of the emperor, and they keep power for the better part of 300 years. And they consolidate their power by taking control of the daimyo class. They really clamp down on these guys and make them do a lot of things like live part of their year in the capital city and things like that, where they can really control them. The other thing they do is they expel Christians from Japan, and then they close Japan off to all European trade. They still trade with China and in Asia, but they do not allow Europeans in because they do not want the cultural pollution. That will eventually change in the back half of the 19th century. Okay, moving on to Mughal Japan and Akbar the Great. Okay, as I've already said, he practiced religious tolerance, and part of this was allowing non-Muslims to be part of his government. And the reason he had to do this is because his big problem is he is a minority ruler. He is a Muslim. Muslims are only 20% of Indian population, so you need to keep the majority happy or they're going to overthrow you. One of the ways he kind of put this all in place was through the zamindars. Okay, they are the feudal lords of India. They're really the landowning class. They have the power to tax and control territory, so as long as he had them on board, he was in pretty good shape. Later, as the Mughal Empire falters, these guys sell their power to tax to the British in exchange for special status. Okay, another way rulers legitimize powers through art and architecture, and we did some stuff with that on the architecture, the Ottomans, and also in Islam, and also with the French. But here are just a list of some ways that rulers tried to legitimize or consolidate power. Peter the Great built St. Petersburg, as I said. It was a window on the west. It was styled after the capitals of Western Europe. Anytime you do a lot of building, it shows that you can marshal resources in these big buildings, impress people, and legitimize your rule. Askia the Great of Songhai in West Africa encouraged learning and literacy, and he creates really a golden age of Muslim scholarship to legitimize his rule. Shah Jahan in the Mughal Empire builds the Taj Mahal, a shrine to his deceased wife. It's one of the great wonders of the world. It's a huge, big piece of architecture. The Ottomans, we spent a good deal of time looking at what they did. And probably the most famous piece is the Suleymaniye Mosque, the largest mosque in Islam. They adopted much of the Persian style of art also. And then finally you have Louis XIV in the palace at Versailles that he built as a monument to his rule. Okay, how did they pay for all this? Okay, and we're going to come back to this at the end of the unit also with some of the empires. Russia, a lot of the way they paid for their rule was on the fur trade, but also the sale of natural resources, and then heavy taxation. The Ottomans were the go-between in the trade with Europe, and they also taxed non-Muslims. The Mughal Empire specialized in trade, but they also collected tribute from conquered peoples. The Ming Dynasty was mostly tribute, as was Qing China. The Aztecs were a tribute-based society, and Songhai really made its money off of taxing the salt and gold trade. Okay, so now we're going to move on to topic 3.3. I'm going to leave you with a picture of the palace at Versailles.